Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. This week I'm going to go through my 5 top tips for improving your functional threshold power or your FTP. If you don't know what FTP is, it's basically an approximation of your threshold, and you usually get this number by doing the 20-minute test. There's a couple of other tests, but the 20-minute test is the most common. All you need for the test is a power meter. You should ideally have heart rate as well, but a power meter is critical. So what you do is you pedal as hard as you can for 20 minutes and you take 95% of the best average power you can manage, and this gives you a number that you can structure your training zones out of. It's particularly useful if you're following a preset program or a remote program where you can get your training basically given to you as a percentage of your FTP. So it's really practical and it's something that's quite easy to use. It has some limitations. It's particularly good if your races are between, say, 20 minutes and 40 minutes. But once you go over the hour mark, it's probably not the best test to use. So it is worth keeping in mind if you're doing long stages or half Ironman or Ironman, the FTP test does have its limitations. But without any further delay, I'm going to go through my 5 top training sessions for improving your FTP. If you found it useful, please make sure to subscribe and make sure to share with your friends. My 5th choice session for developing FTP are VO2 intervals. So you can do these in 2 ways. You can do really short high intensity burst efforts with short rest, or you can do extended high effort reps. I prefer the second version. So you do something like anywhere between 2.5 minutes to 6 minutes of really hard effort. They'll be absolute lung busters, but they're very good for developing your ceiling, and they're quite good for teaching you to mentally tough out really hard intensities. They are very hard to recover from, and they also tend to develop the glycolytic system a little bit as well. So it's not ideal that you're developing your ability to produce lactate, especially if you're doing really long distance events. So while I would definitely use this because it will help your FTP test, it's not always my first choice if I'm trying to work on other distances. So my 4th method of choice is low cadence intervals. And basically what you're doing here is you're using an artificially low cadence, somewhere between 55 and 65 RPM at your usual power output. And it basically keeps load throughout the entire pedal stroke and actually smooths out your pedal stroke, making it more efficient and basically stronger. This is particularly good if you want to roll a really big gear in a time trial and kind of keep your high speed up. It also encourages the type 2B fibers to become a little bit more aerobic. So if they're producing a little bit less lactate, when you're trying to hold higher intensities for longer periods of time, you'll accumulate less lactate and you basically endure the effort a lot better. The only issue that you might want to keep in mind when you're doing low cadence work or high force work is that if you've got any injuries or prone to injury, you are in a very static position at an exaggerated load. And probably the best way to get around it is to do short intervals and then in your rest breaks kind of really spin a little bit faster and shake off the bones. And then just gradually build up the durations that you're sitting in those static positions, producing those higher forces. And if you do that, you should be able to build into it and you'll get great results out of low cadence work. My 3rd training tip for FTP is the king of all training, and that's the long, slow, steady state work, the zone 2 work. This is where you're going to build all your aerobic capacity, and this is where you're going to build your engine. The only difficulty with zone 2 work is trying to find the time to do it. There's really no reason why you shouldn't be doing it other than not being able to find the time, and you really should be dedicating as much time as you can to long, slow, steady efforts to try and build your aerobic capacity as much as possible. It'll help you clear lactate and it'll help you reduce the rate of its production, so you'll be able to work harder for longer. That's exactly what you want to increase your FTP. So my second method of choice would be sweet spot training. This is high aerobic work and it's going to develop your aerobic capacity just before you kind of go into threshold. So it's not quite as hard as threshold, it's still aerobic, but it's at a high enough intensity it's going to push what your aerobic capacity can work with. It's fantastic for keeping your lactate production low over harder efforts. The only thing about sweet spot that makes it a little bit difficult is you're going to want to go a little bit harder because it's going to feel just a little bit too easy. So you've got to have a lot of patience in sort of staying below that threshold ceiling and not just kind of blowing all the way up through it. So you've just got to be patient and keep it just a little bit below what you know you can cope with. And if you do that, sweet spot work will do a lot. So time for tip number 1. 20-minute time trial efforts are the single best way for improving your FTP result. If you do them regularly, your pacing for that test is going to improve dramatically, and you're going to see quite good improvements. And you're also going to see a bit of a physiological bump. You're going to adapt to that kind of demand, so you're going to get better. If you're solely focused on FTP numbers, 20-minute tests are great, but if you're doing longer distances, you do run the risk of becoming quite glycolytic and very good for 20 minutes, but not so good for things above that sort of time duration. So here I have a little bonus tip around watts per kilo at FTP. Some people have been asking me about that. At some point, increasing your wattage at FTP is going to be difficult. You might be looking for very, very small increments. And if you really want to improve your watts per kilo, it might be more beneficial to lose some weight. Now you need to be sort of careful, because if you're extremely heavy, you need to produce a huge amount of watts to have a good watts per kilo. But if you can lose a little bit of weight without losing too much power, then you'll actually improve that number quite well. The only issue is if you lose too much weight too fast, you're likely to lose power too, and the whole watts per kilo number goes down again. So it is a bit of a balancing act. Losing a little bit of weight, if you can sustain the power, will generally yield a better watts per kilo number at FTP. So there you have it. They are my favorite tips for improving your FTP. If you found this beneficial, make sure to subscribe and share with your friends. And if you do have any questions, you want to know a little bit more, just ask them in the comments below and I'll get to them. I'm actually going to leave a couple of links in the description to some articles on the website which go into FTP in a little bit more detail, and we'll have some other information there that you might find beneficial. So thanks again for joining, and I will see you next time.